Right, let's just give it another 10, 15 seconds, and then we will get started. All right, welcome to the Quincy Institute's panel discussion titled The Human Rights Impact of Broad-Based Economic Sanctions. Time to rethink our approach. My name is Sridhar Parsi. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, a think tank in Washington that promotes ideas that move US foreign policy away from endless war and toward rigorous diplomacy. We favor a US national security strategy that is centered on diplomacy and military restraint. Over the past 3 decades, we have seen an explosion in the United States' use of broad-based economic sanctions. Policymakers on both sides of the aisle view sanctions as an attractive, low-cost foreign policy tool that has almost no domestic political consequences for them. Sanctions are also often seen as an alternative to war and justified on human rights grounds. Yet the economic pain inflicted on the target country is supposed to compel it to cease its human rights abuses oftentimes. But are broad-based economic sanctions themselves an instrument that violates human rights by increasing the suffering of the civilian population? Growing evidence shows that broad-based economic sanctions have disastrous human rights impacts on the ground, causing starvation, shortages in critical medicines, electricity, and even clean water. Which leads to the question, is it time to rethink our usage of broad-based economic sanctions precisely because of the disastrous impact it has on civilian populations? To address these important questions, we have an excellent panel with 3 prominent experts in this field. But before I introduce our panelists, let me just remind you that you can ask your questions to the panelists by putting them into the Q&A function in the Zoom. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you can also put it into the comment section, and we'll try to get to those questions as well. Same true if you're watching this on Facebook. Now, with no further ado, let's get started. We have 3 excellent panelists. First off is Asli Bali, who is a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute and professor of law at the UCLA School of Law, where she served as the founding faculty director of the Promise Institute for Human Rights. She's currently served as a co-chair of the advisory board for the Middle East division of Human Rights Watch and as the chair of the task force on civil and human rights for the Middle East Studies Association. She has written extensively on these topics, and we will address some of those writings in our conversation today. Then we have Peter Beinart, who is a professor of journalism and political science at the Newmark School of Journalism at the City University of New York. He's also the editor-at-large of Jewish Currents and non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace and a CNN political commentator. He has written extensively on this issue, and I would bring particular attention to his recent New York Times op-ed on US sanctions entitled America's Other Forever War. And if you haven't already, please make sure that you subscribe to the Beinart Notebook on Substack. I think we will have a link to it in the chat. It's an excellent newsletter. You will not regret it. And finally, we have Josh Landis, who is a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute and Sandra Mackey Chair and Professor of Middle East Studies at the University of California. He writes and manages the SyriaComment.com, a daily newsletter on Syrian politics that attracts some 50,000 page reads a month. He is one of America's foremost experts on Syria. So let me get straight to the very heart of the topic. Asli, in Boston Review, you wrote, together with your co-author, that sanctions, whatever the conventional presentation, are not an humane alternative to war. In reality, they routinely impose indiscriminate harms on civilian populations in ways that far exceed what would be permissible on the battlefield. Please unpack this for us. You are essentially saying that the harm that sanctions, economic, broad-based sanctions, are having on civilian population is actually worse than war at times, at least in terms of what is permitted in war, but not regulated at all when it comes to economic sanctions. Can you explain this further?
Yeah, I think the key word in the sentence that you quoted there from my piece with Aziz Rana is indiscriminate. So in the battlefield, there is a requirement of distinction between civilians and military targets, be they soldiers or military infrastructure. But in the world of sanctions, there isn't any such distinction. Indeed, no such distinction is remotely possible for the reasons that you pointed to in your introductory comments, Trita. The economic consequences of broad-based sanctions affect health infrastructure, water and sanitation, the possibility of sustaining education, access to critical foods. These are what are necessary for the sustaining of the welfare, humanitarian welfare of civilian populations. So the very things that are targeted are directly tied to civilians. You can take any number of examples. For instance, there's a widely cited, sometimes contested figure, but nonetheless, one that has largely been confirmed and sourced to sources like UNICEF, medical journals, and so forth, of 500,000 deaths of children as a consequence of the embargo that was placed on Iraq during the 13-year sanctions regime that was imposed on Iraq 12-year sanctions regime imposed following the invasion of Kuwait. There is no way that you could possibly undertake lawfully on a battlefield any strategy that would have the consequence of disproportionately harming children. But this has, in fact, been the predictable consequence in terms of infant mortality rates and stunting of human development of children in many countries where economic sanctions have been imposed. And just looking only at the health consequences, we see a rise in malaria cases. We see rises in common bacterial infections that would be easily preventable under other circumstances. We see outbreaks of mass epidemics in otherwise largely controlled diseases like cholera. We see typhus, we see measles. I mean, these are the kinds of consequences just in the health area, not to speak of the food insecurity, malnutrition, just the enormous consequences of sanctions that are really the predictable result of imposing broad sanctions. And notwithstanding the much touted logic of targeted sanctions, when it comes to some of the US's principal adversaries in the international system, we don't impose targeted sanctions. We impose broad-based economic sanctions, whether on Iran or Syria or Venezuela or Cuba or others, historically, like the Iraqi case I just cited, and we impose secondary sanctions that coerce other countries to share in our strategy of imposing these kinds of conditions on humanitarian populations. So taken all of this together, the scale of the damage that can be tied to broad-based economic sanctions may at times well exceed what civilians would bear in the brunt of permissible strategies on the military battlefield.
And why is that not a bigger issue in that sense? I mean, why is it that given this, you still have a rather common phenomenon in which on the basis of seeking to protect human rights, including human rights activists, that this is still the tool of preference?
Look, anyone working in the humanitarian field or human rights knows that the notion of sanctions to promote human rights or humanitarian sanctions is just an oxymoron. I mean, that is a strategy for selling this particular set of policies to domestic audiences by presenting it as either more humane, as you said in your introductory comments, or non-military. And I would contest both of those claims. To begin with, and as Peter Beinart has also written, we can now analogize the comprehensive blockades that we see in certain countries, notably American adversaries, that are being imposed to economic siege, which is a military tactic. So we see tactics that really draw on the military playbook that are being deployed under the cover of sanctions. Sanctions also satisfy domestic audiences in not only by being presented as a non-military option, but also because they impose few costs on the sending state. So the country that's imposing sanctions does not absorb the cost and can be inattentive to the consequences. So we rarely see meaningful assessments, for example, of the civilian impact of sanctions. And when there are such assessments provided by third parties, we point to things like humanitarian carve-outs, licensing regimes that purportedly exempt foodstuffs or medicines from the sanctions regime. But what we can see plainly when we look at any number of countries here, Iran and Yemen particularly come to mind, where you have those carve-outs, they are ineffective. And they are ineffective because suppliers simply do not want to absorb the additional transaction cost or the risks associated with trading with a country that is facing a comprehensive embargo or an actor that has been listed as a terrorist entity. And this radically complicates the possibility of delivering basic humanitarian assistance to civilian populations and undermines their human rights without question. Nonetheless, because the audiences in, domestic audiences in the United States, for example, are not well aware of these consequences and understand sanctions as an alternative to direct military action, they're much easier to sell. And that, I think, is a problem that we need to, increase our own efforts to draw attention to. And this event is, I think, part of that strategy. And what we really need to do is develop an actual alternative to coercive means, whether they be direct military action or these kinds of coercive sanctions. In order to advance our political objectives, we need to define objectives that are attainable and define appropriate tools that are properly tailored to achieving those objectives. Neither direct military action nor sanctions meet that set of objectives, in my view. And so we should understand sanctions as much part of the story of forever war, and therefore as much susceptible to the logics of restraint as the forms of more direct military action that occasion resistance amongst domestic audiences.
Very interesting. And you mentioned in your comments there, both that this should be seen as part of forever war. You also use the word siege. And that brings me to Peter. Your piece in New York Times did specifically talk about sanctions as being a siege. You did not want to call them sanctions. Could you explain to us why you chose those words, and also explain what happened in the Iraqi case in terms of, because what Ashley's talking about in some ways appears as if, inadvertently it leads to humanitarian goods not going in there. But what happened with the oil for sales scheme during the Iraq sanctions was not that inadvertently those goods could not make it to Iraq. On the contrary. Could you explain that a little bit further, Peter? You're on mute.
I wanted to acknowledge that I was really influenced in writing my piece by the piece that Asli co-authored, and also by Joy Gordon's book, Invisible War, which I would really highly recommend along with her other work. I did not come into this as a sanctions expert. I am not a sanctions expert, but I was lucky enough to benefit from people who really are. And one of the things I think is always really important in public policy debates, in foreign policy debates, is to try to get past some of the language that often euphemistic language, or kind of wonky language that obscures what's actually happening and desensitizes people. So it's a term like secondary sanctions, which is the term that's often used. Doesn't pack any emotional punch, and people kind of gloss over it and go on to their Instagram accounts. But if you actually try to find a kind of a more human way of talking about what's happening, which is essentially not just that the US says, we won't trade with you, but essentially we try to to force the rest of the world to not trade with a besieged country as well. I think that creates rightly a kind of a military analogy to what's actually happening. And in the case of Iraq, the United States used its power at the United Nations, and Joy Gordon really has kind of all the documentation on this, to have a definition of dual use items that was so sweeping that Iraq could not bring in antibiotics, dental equipment. I mean, just many of them basic things for life. And I think, one of the things that's so striking, and I think that we in the media really have to look at it, is it's not as if in the 1990s, there were not people who were talking about the consequences for Iraqi society. You didn't have to be a Saddam Hussein apologist. You didn't have to get it from the Iraqi government. There were UN official after UN official who were resigning and speaking out, basically, because they were saying, we're destroying an entire society here. And yet the kind of debate in Washington, and I feel like in many ways we're still mired in many of these terms, was essentially to say, if you challenge sanctions, you were therefore on the side of Saddam Hussein, right? Which was ridiculous, because actually Saddam Hussein wasn't really being hurt by the sanctions. In many ways, it was actually helping to prop up his regime. What it was just doing was destroying impoverished people in Iraq, and meaning that those who could get out got out, which is part of the reason that we didn't have the kind of civil society that might have allowed Iraq to go in a different direction after the United States invaded, or that there was also an inability to actually think about alternative policy outcomes, which would have been more realistic in terms of the power that the US had. And I think that part of what props up makes it so difficult for people in Congress to have an alternative conversation about sanctions and to look instead at diplomacy is that diplomacy requires give and take, right? Sanctions allows this kind of mythic idea that basically as long as we keep punishing these countries, eventually they're just going to fold. The regimes are going to collapse, or they're going to give up on things like nuclear weapons that in the case of North Korea, they clearly have decided is absolutely necessary for their regime. And so it suspends in animation a debate because nobody wants to actually step forward and say, you know what, we don't have the power, whether these are good outcomes or not, we don't have the power to achieve them. We're overestimating American power. So let's have a real world conversation about what we can actually achieve with actual tools that are actually morally defensible.
Mute now, sorry. I want to get back to what you just said there, because I think you're right. There's definitely a lack of desire to acknowledge that some of the objectives cannot be achieved. But I think there's also potentially other unstated objectives that we pursue. And that's part of the reason why we keep it. And I want to get back to that. But I want to bring Josh into the conversation. In the case of Iraq, as Peter also pointed to, we had essentially, as the UN officials said, a destruction of society. And it is correct that there were UN officials that spoke out about the danger of sanctions, resigned even in some cases over the impact of sanctions on society. But I do wonder if the decibel has increased now. I mean, we have a situation in which the Trump administration imposed terrorism designation on the Houthis, and there was an outcry from humanitarian organizations pointing out that this is going to prevent humanitarian trade to go into Yemen, and this was reversed once Biden came in. In the case of Syria, however, it does not seem to be any appetite for reversal of the Caesar Act or other types of sanctions that have been imposed. And my question to you is, are we going to see in Syria in a couple of years the same type of phenomenon that we saw in Iraq after years of sanctions, and in the case of Syria, years of civil war as well, in which essentially it will become an ungovernable state at some point?
Well, Trita, I want to reiterate what Peter and Usli have said. This really is, we're already seeing those outcomes in Syria. They're already there. People are starving, and medical equipment is not getting into the country. Prices have gone up. This is a siege. It is war by other means, and people are going to die in large numbers because it's completely indiscriminate, as Usli pointed out. And if we put the Syria sanctions into the larger context of American policy, I think it becomes starkly clear that this is war by other means, and it's a very broad-based war. And if we just take the words of Special Envoy Jim Jeffries, Jim Jeffrey was sent out there, Ambassador Jim Jeffrey, who was an ambassador in Iraq by Trump. And he really put together and articulated a policy that Biden is continuing, which was to deny as much of Syria in the north to Assad as possible, which is about 35% of the country. And there are three different zones. There's the Kurdish, predominantly Kurdish area in the northeast, where the Syrian Democratic Forces, named by an American colonel, have most of the oil, most of the agriculture, and control much of the water of Syria. So the vital resources for the nation, for feeding the nation and driving electricity and other important elements of the nation are excluded, are kept away from the government and the Syrian people, the majority of the Syrian people who are living under the government's control. In northern Aleppo, another province, Turkey has its proxies there. And then there's Idlib province, which is ruled by Mohammed al-Baghdadi, Mohammed al-Jawlani, but he was the right-hand man of Caliph Baghdadi. He fought with al-Qaeda in Iraq. He was sent out by Caliph Baghdadi to start the Syrian part of the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, and he did, which was Nusra. He broke away from Baghdadi eventually, giving his allegiance to Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and then he broke away from that and has created HTS, this Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which runs Idlib. And just recently, Ambassador Jeffrey said he is an American asset, called him an American asset, because he's helping to deny this important agricultural province to Assad. So there are these three sections which are denying the Syrian people vital parts of their country, which is part of the sanctions regime. And a third part is to sabotage Iranian oil tankers that are coming through the Suez Canal, going up to Syria, to feed them with oil, because Syria can't get oil from anybody else because of these sanctions and secondary sanctions. And so to get the electricity to run, vitally important to running schools, hospitals, you name it, you need that oil. And over 12 of those ships, we learned just recently in the Wall Street Journal, have been sabotaged by putting mines on them and scuttled. So this is keeping the oil from going to Syria. So really, this is a very broad-based policy. And James Jeffrey, when we get to the language, in theory, this is to bring democratic transition and a political solution based on UN Resolution 2254, which is supposed to bring elections overseen by the UN. Now, this is impossible to achieve given the tools of starving the Syrian people, which is what this is really about. Starve the Syrian people. In theory, Assad will leave, the UN will take over, there'll be free elections, and the opposition will get to have a part of the government. That's the idea. But of course, it's completely unrealistic. And James Jeffrey said this as much, and he's given a bunch of exit interviews, which I recommend everybody read, because he said, look, these are our high aims, and why not articulate them? We understand they're unrealistic, but what my job was to turn Syria into a quagmire for Iran and Russia, and to defend Israel, of course. And that was his goal. And he said we can do it by denying them their resources, stopping oil from getting in, and sanctioning. Secondary sanctions. Any businessmen and the Caesar sanctions are designed, and they say in them that they're targeting the electric grid that was largely destroyed. 50% of the plants were destroyed from being rebuilt, as well as from the oil infrastructure. So any businessman from Lebanon or Jordan or Turkey who goes in and tries to invest in rebuilding the electric plants will get secondary sanctions. And so this puts a very high cost for the regime to try to rebuild its electric infrastructure. And I just got a note from a friend in Syria the other day who said, we're getting 1 hour out of maybe 5 of electricity. Nobody is getting electricity. My wife was wanting, and kids were going to go and visit their grandparents in Syria. Grandfather, who's 82, said, don't come. There's no electricity. This is just miserable here. He said his pension and his wife's pension, who was a school teacher, used to add up to almost $500 a month, which was a king's pension in Syria at the time, before the revolution. Today, he said, we did the math. He said, I can buy 8 roasted chickens at the local chicken shop with our combined pensions. They're completely dependent on money coming from children. And most Syrians don't have that. And that's why 80% of Syrians live below the poverty line. They're completely dependent on handouts. The Syrian national budget has shrunk to $3.6 billion a year. That's for 14 million people, 15 million people. It's nothing. The Syrian state is withering, which is the objective of American sanctions and the American regime to try to strangle Syria. But it's causing the little people to starve. The regime people, who it's theoretically supposed to target, who they claim it's targeting, are eating full three-course meals. They're living like Marie Antoinette, and they're not going to leave Syria because the people are starving. They've proven that after 10 years of civil war. So this is really a heartless policy that's hurting the little people. And it's turning Syria into a quagmire, and it is a quagmire today. Now, it's not the only thing that's doing that. The collapse of the bankruptcy in Lebanon, there are other factors, the civil war, there are many other factors that have immiserated the Syrian people. But clearly, this policy of denying resources, sanctioning, and sabotaging any effort to supply Syria is really starving people.
Could I jump in here to just
Please.
address a couple of things that Peter and Josh have both put on the table? The first thing is I think that we should highlight or underscore is the symbolic politics of sanctions, which have just, I think, been highlighted nicely by both of these presentations. So Peter pointed out that, to a large degree, we have a kind of sanctions antiseptic language that suggests that we're secondary sanctions. It just doesn't grip you in any way. So there's, first of all, the symbolic reality that the language and the way that we describe sanctions obscures the picture that Joshua just laid out. But there's the other aspect, which you also pointed to, that Peter also pointed to, which is that we tend to use a symbolic politics of sanctions in this Manichaean logic about our adversaries. So in order to resist Iraq sanctions, you're framed as an apologist for Saddam. If you have concerns about the consequences of sanctions in Syria, you're an apologist for Assad. And that logic not only inhibits critical thinking about what these sanctions are accomplishing for individuals like ourselves, right? In this panel, undoubtedly, each of us will, be targeted by all kinds of folks that think we've done X or Y thing that advances whatever bad actor's goals. But in addition to that, it has real commercial implications. So the normal sort of set of actors in the private sector that you would expect after a decade would begin to resist the logic of sanctions, pharmaceuticals, Boeing in the case of Iran, whoever it may be, actually won't do that. They won't spend the political capital necessary, the soft power necessary to appear to look as if they are saying something that advances an Iranian objective or a Syrian objective or whoever. So you actually fully disable the possibility of having either meaningful critical engagement or the ordinary kinds of give and take that occur around economic policy choices. So to the extent that there is any domestic cost, it's going to be absorbed by domestic actors who simply do not want to wade into this universe of symbolic politics that's just been triggered here. And that also connects to the point Peter made about multilateral diplomacy. It requires engagement. This is true, first of all, with our adversaries, right? So sanctions are not just, they're a tool that enable us to tell our domestic audience that we're engaging in non-military action, while in fact, choosing a coercive course towards adversaries that requires no possibility of compromise, engagement. But secondary sanctions have the effect of also coercing our allies. That's the other group of people. We're not persuading anyone of American foreign policy objectives. We're simply compelling them to go along by threatening their domestic industries as well. And their domestic industries face the same exact problems that a US Boeing may face in this context, that they may object, they may have interest at stake, but they simply do not individually have their cost benefit analysis is going to say, we're not going to be the one to try to resist Iran policy. So even as the EU, as an example, has made explicit its rejection of Trump administration goals in their sort of maximum pressure campaign, European actors have had no choice but to go along with these secondary sanctions. So it's not only we're not engaging on the basic front of we're not trying to de-escalate the dyadic adversarial relationship, we're also basically dragging allies and the rest of the world along with us in a strategy of coercion with no multilateral engagement, which means the question of something like rebuilding Syria. We're not going to have a meaningful forum to discuss that unless we are able to roll back the posture that we're in now, and we're not engaging diplomatically in a way that makes that feasible.
And you write about this as well, Ashley, in the sense that you are pointing out that on the one hand, we're talking about the rules-based global order, but then we have secondary sanctions. And just to further explain that to the audience, if you are a Spanish citizen, usually the laws that apply to you are the laws that are enacted by the Spanish parliament that you have a chance of electing or unelected. Here now, we're in a situation in which you have those laws, but in addition to that, you're also going to have to abide by American laws that will applied to the territory you're living in, and you're not living in the United States, because now suddenly the United States is enacting laws for the entire globe, and this has now more or less become almost accepted. But it is in complete contradiction with the idea of having a rules-based order, because it can't just be one country that is setting the rules for the entire globe.
Let me jump in here, because I can give you a concrete example of this in Syria, which is trying to rebuild its electric grid by developing 2 electric generation plants. And this friend who's in the electric business in Syria, Syrian, wrote to me and said the Tishreen extension, which was one, was contracted with an Indian company, and that company transferred money for us to resume work, and 25% of this plant was built. But then it came to a screeching halt because they couldn't continue because of the Caesar sanctions, which would have been secondary sanctions on them, and so they stopped sending any money or anything else, this stopped. In the second plant in Deir ez-Zor, which is a big provincial capital which needs electricity, Gazprom Bank had lent money and issued the letter of credit for developing a big plant. And that came to a screeching halt because they don't want to be sanctioned by the United States. And so these 2 projects, which are going to bring vital electricity to allow schools to work and so forth, came to a halt. And I can even use the example of my brother-in-law, who became more dependent on the government because of these sanctions. The idea is that sanctions will force Syrian people to hate their government, and they'll rise up and overthrow it or put pressure on it to do something. But the example of my brother-in-law, who has a small plastic factory, got some machines that make plastic bags, and he had a plant in Tartus. He couldn't get any electricity, and he couldn't run his plant. And generators, there was no oil to run generators, and it was very expensive to do it, wouldn't allow him to produce the bags. So he moved his machines to a small plant in Latakia, which is a free trade zone supported by the government, which gets more electricity, and it's prioritized and it's subsidized by the Syrian government. So he's completely dependent on this electricity supplied by the Syrian government now. And, that's what's happening to everybody. Everybody's lining up. Wheat, bread is given as a subsidized price through muassasat, these government stores. And everybody who used to buy their bread from the private bakeries no longer can go there because they can't afford it. So they have to line up at government bakeries. They're totally dependent on the government. The government's budget for this year, 40% of it goes to subsidizing electricity and bread. And the people are eating out of the hands of the government. They can't afford to bite it. And so these sanctions, the logic of the sanctions is just crazy.
So, and Josh, we have a question from the audience. Paul Rodriguez asks about, can U.S. sanctions on Cuba, the longest in time and more comprehensive and extraterritorial, be ethically and morally justified? And I want to just get a quick take from you. Do we have examples in which all of this suffering ultimately, nevertheless, leads to a good place because the regimes fall and a democratic alternative emerges, and people live more or less happily ever after? So, is there a situation in which actually, the objectives can be achieved, so this is a price that is worth paying?
Well, I should really defer to Usli. I will to Peter, because, there should be a limitation for 2 years on sanctions. Because if it doesn't work, if the regimes hang in there like North Korea, Iran, Cuba, you can go down the list, Venezuela, they're not going to change. The object of changing the regime or changing regime behavior, once it's proven to fail, all you're doing is starving people.
Peter?
Asli, sorry, I didn't know if Asli wanted to jump in.
I'll come in after you, Peter.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about where, given that for so many years, these sanctions policies have been so ineffective, and that it's very, very, very difficult to find any. I mean, you can point to You can point to South Africa, which in some ways is the kind of exception that proves the rules, but it's a very, very different case, right? It's not a case where the U.S. is dealing with a geopolitical adversary. It's a case where the U.S. is dealing with a country that had been essentially America had supported for a long time, but because of popular pressure around the world, inside the United States and inside South Africa, the U.S. government was very, very reluctantly forced to cut ties with the regime that it wanted. So the question is, what is the template that suggests that this is the right model? And I'm just going to throw out something. I don't know if I could prove it. I think a lot of it comes from this mythic notion of how the U.S. brought down the Soviet Union. We have these two big. If the very little of American foreign policy is actually based on America's experience with the developing world, because America's developing with the developing world is just impossible to integrate into the American exceptionalist narrative we have about us as the champions of democracy and freedom. So the two stories that are told again and again and again are that we defeated the Nazis by force, but we didn't go to war with the Soviets, right? So what is the dominant narrative inside the Republican Party, and I think even in much of the mainstream Democratic Party? Well, it's basically that we were really, really tough on them. And especially again, Republicans with Ronald Reagan, right? Ronald Reagan really, really pushed them up against the wall and they cracked. And so I think this, without being stated, became a kind of a Cold War template for all these little mini Soviet unions in the axis of evil that we were now going to face now that the big enemy was no longer there. It was total nonsense, right? I mean, actually, what the most significant thing that Ronald Reagan did to help facilitate the end of Soviet control of Eastern Europe was to adopt a radically pro-Gorbachev position starting and even in 1985, and basically make Gorbachev's job easier politically after it became clear the Soviet Union was massively overextended and it couldn't do this. But I think that becomes in some ways the template for this. And part of what I think we are reaping the costs of is the fact that progressives and Democrats in the United States never have really successfully contested the narrative that came out of the Cold War, that then became a kind of a template for America to prove me much more aggressive when we didn't have a rival superpower for these couple of decades where we basically just started, amassing sanctions upon sanctions on our adversaries.
Ashley, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would endorse that hypothesis, of course, again, without being able to demonstrate it empirically. But the thing that we can point to is the explosion of sanctions regimes in the 1990s, and that's often referred to as the sanctions decade. So in the immediate post-Cold War period, the sort of confidence that these strategies were going to attain objectives. To your question, Trita, of course, they never have. There's absolutely no empirical evidence at all of a relationship between comprehensive sanctions and the attaining the objective of regime change directly. That every time has, been comprehensive sanctions followed by some form of military intervention that has resulted in regime change, which is to say the toppling of a government. And then, of course, attached to that military intervention is the absolute incapacity that the United States has demonstrated over and over again of ever then establishing effective governance again in the territory where that regime change occurred. But the regime change itself does not occur as a consequence of sanctions. And the reason for this is exactly what Joshua pointed to, which is what's true in Iraq. Iraq can be the template for how we think about this more generally, which is, first of all, sanctions that we present as starving Saddam or starving Assad are actually a form of collective punishment that are starving a civilian population. Because of the consequences of the embargo, that civilian population becomes far more dependent on the regime we claim we're seeking to dispatch. And as a consequence, that regime's capacity to control its society is enhanced by our sanctions that are allegedly designed to overthrow that regime. So that logic, the counterintuitive actual effect of the sanctions is to entrench. So Saddam Hussein may well have had a longer duration in power following his defeat in 1991 as a consequence of 12 years of sanctions. And indeed, his regime, hardliners within his regime, may have become parasitically dependent on those sanctions in order to run an effective black market, control goods that are coming into the country, and so forth. And we see this effect again and again in countries that are the target of these kinds of sanctions. They become, in a sense, autarkic with regimes that control all of the resources that are within the territory or a disproportionate amount and control much of the private sector activity. So that distinction begins to collapse, and the very resource that the US typically presents itself as supporting middle classes in countries, civil society as rising up, is actually stamped out and destroyed. And And that's the effect of sanctions. Now, you can have a situation like Syria where you have so many causal factors, it's basically impossible to sort of disentangle a causal story about how much is sanctions versus civil war versus decisions by the government, et cetera, really responsible for immiseration. But there are other places where we can see the direct and near exclusive effects of sanctions, including the prolonging of regime duration. And I think Cuba is a great example of that, which is the question that you began us with.
On a bigger issue, it's really amazing that the United States in the 50s and 60s tried to fight tyranny and communist regimes with Marshall Plan, Point Four money, development, and that was the wisdom of America, and why America became so appealing to much of the world, because it was considered free trade, development, get rich. Today, we've almost reversed that. When you look at the number of countries that we are starving and that we have sanctions on and we're punishing, we've turned into the punishing country. And China is going to eat our lunch because it's offering just what the United States used to offer in the 1950s, which is development aid and with few questions asked and no imperialism, theoretically. Now, of course, China will probably develop into imperial country as America has in its turn. But the point is, today, it's very stark how America has changed from being a country that supports the middle class around the world to become richer and happier in theory, rather than one that punishes them and uses these very difficult regimes.
So kind of summing up here, we see that when we impose broad-based economic sanctions, we have a less of a likelihood of a country moving in a democratic direction, as Asli pointed out. Peter, you have written about how it actually tends to break down norms and laws in countries, the targeted countries, and in the long run, it's really difficult to reestablish those norms. So you actually get more lawlessness, which again is really not conducive towards having building a democratic society. We see that the human rights situation tends to become much worse, not only because the population is more dependent on the regime and the regime can become more repressive in order to retain control, but also because of the direct effects of the sanctions on the population. One aspect of it that is not oftentimes addressed is that this still passes because we believe that sanctions is an alternative to war, as both Peter and Asli has pointed out. Reality is, though, there's studies that show that as countries impose sanctions, it actually increases the likelihood of a military confrontation because of the signaling impact and the fact that you enter into a negative cycle that becomes extremely difficult to withdraw yourself from, particularly for democratic countries. So not only does it not achieve those humanitarian objectives, it actually increases the likelihood of war itself. And it raises the question then, with all of this, can we have a conversation? I know many people in the Q&A have asked this. What are actually the real objectives or alternative explanations for sanctions? And I want to throw out a thesis here and I'll get your reaction to it. To me, it seems like oftentimes sanctions are actually imposed in order to cement the conflict, contain in the long run a country and slowly but surely destroying it because you get a favorable balance of power out of that outcome. Now you pretend that it's for human rights, you pretend that it's because you want to get rid of the regime, but in reality, you don't care that much about that. You just want to keep that one country as destroyed as possible. Take the example of Iraq, for instance. If it was seen as a threat under Saddam Hussein after both sanctions and war, even though democracy was never really achieved, John Bolton still views it as a major success because from his perspective, he wanted to remove Iraq from the geopolitical chessboard, and he did. It was successful in that sense. Is this something that you think is just in the case of Iraq, perhaps in the case of Iran, or do you think it's more widely applicable as an alternative motivation, a motivation that understandably politicians do not necessarily want to talk about, but may actually be the key motivating factor behind these decisions?
Yeah, I think this is an instrument by which the United States kind of kneecaps countries that we believe could challenge our power, influence, interests in certain regions of the globe, and this is one instrument, and the U.S. has used many, since it became a world power. One of the things that the United States did a lot during the Cold War was foment coups against governments that might kind of move outside of the orbit of American power, or might challenge economic interests that were powerful in the United States. And this is so this is another mechanism for doing that. And sometimes it's it has the and sometimes it also serves the interests of American allies that also have those interests, right? So in the Middle East, obviously America's allies in the Gulf, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and Israel want Iran to be weak, and so the power of the United States in keeping Iran weak through these sanctions serves their interests as well. But what happens is that we don't have often a kind of a really, I think, honest discourse about that. And so the language that's often deployed is either a language of nuclear proliferation, while we turn the other way, when the countries that we have better relationships with proliferate their nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction. And then the other is the language of human rights, But again, the language of human rights really just doesn't make any sense. I mean, yes, many of these regimes are really, really despicable regimes, right? But just the most basic kind of almost childlike logic would be to suggest that if you want to reduce American complicity with human rights abuses, right? The first thing you do, for instance, is stop selling weapons to governments that do terrible things, right? I mean, there we actually it's our weapons that are doing these terrible things. These other regimes that are adversaries are doing terrible things, but we're not implicated in the same way because we're not funding them, we're not arming them, right? So it seems to me, it makes first sense to at least make some effort to clean up your own house. And yet many of the people who are the kind of most self-righteous and moralistic about these sanctions policies, because they talk about how much they're opposed to these adversarial regimes, many of which, again, are really, really authoritarian, despicable, tyrannical regimes, are also the people who are most enthusiastic about selling U.S. arms to other regimes, let's say in the Gulf, for instance, right, that are virtually just as authoritarian and tyrannical, right? So the real distinction is, are they on our side or not?
Let me just jump in here and say, first of all, I mean, there have been many instances in which sanctions regimes are explicitly tied to containment, right? So, of course, historically, both the Iraqi and original Clinton administration policy with respect to Iran, which also implicated sanctions, was dual containment. So they explicitly named it, and I think that's right. And so when you think the goal is containment, the 2-year sunset on the sanctions provisions, for example, doesn't help because, after 2 years, look, they're still contained. We can continue this indefinitely, that strategy. But some of the other proposals that have been on the table, including by researchers at Quincy or published in Responsible Statecraft, include holding ourselves accountable along the lines that Peter was just pointing to for the human rights consequences of our actions, quite apart from whatever logic we're providing, even if it is a logic of containment for sanctions. If there are enormously adverse direct civilian impacts, which we don't even bother to assess at this point. So you would have to build in an actual impact assessment, as many have argued, for civilian harm. Or if we have sanctions that are that remain in place irrespective of context. There's a global pandemic, we have sanctions. There's a natural disaster, we have sanctions. There's no mechanism at all for suspending, let alone rolling back. Rolling back there's a total absence of that mechanism, but there need to be those basic characteristics for us to even credibly speak in our own name about the consequences we're imposing on those populations that we purport to care about. Why are we containing this actor? Why do we claim that this actor is a bad actor? Why is that actor's role in the region not in our interest? We describe all these things that justify containment also in the language of human rights, right? That we somehow are a positive actor in the region. We can't possibly sustain any of these claims about our own actions while attaching them to these kinds of comprehensive embargoes without in some way altering the mechanisms that we're using, including the secondary sanctions. They're such a bad actor. Their containment is so critical to global security. The United States is providing a kind of global stabilizing regime. Why can't we persuade our allies to support us in that case? Why do we have to coerce them into supporting policies? They obviously don't view these as stabilizing policies, right? They don't think this approach to Iran is the right approach. They consider engagement to be the more stabilizing, more peace-enhancing, better approach to the Middle East. And the Gulf actors or Israel that happen to endorse this maximum pressure style strategy are not the only actors, either in the region or more generally amongst our allies, whose interests ought to count in determining this, even if we accepted the notion that containing adversaries is a legitimate objective, which is, of course, tied to American primacy, tied to other things we might wish to problematize as really contested accounts of how we should understand our own interests. But even setting that aside, there are still deep problems with this particular strategy, coercive strategy towards containment. And just to name, one problem that we are here producing is we're entrenching that adversarial relationship in ways that invite other actors, with which we also have global tensions, to come in and pursue their own strategic interests in the region. And this is something that Joshua was pointing to. China, Russia, many other actors are going to have a reason, not only bilaterally to engage with Iran in ways that evade our containment strategies, but actually to produce broader infrastructure that erodes the American hegemonic role in the financial system globally that enables these secondary sanctions, right? So now we have electronic currencies being proposed by major global adversaries and so on. So even if we're exclusively looking at this from the lens of, is the United States pursuing a coherent set of strategic interests, and you name those interests to be containment, in the pursuit of short-term objectives with respect to containment to basically small adversaries in regions that are, may be central to some of our allies, but secondary in many respects to the United States' own geopolitical position, we are also enabling a system globally in which many actors, including our own allies, are deeply incentivized to find ways to basically disinvest in our hegemonic role in the financial system and find ways to diversify control because they are being coerced themselves through secondary sanctions in ways that undermine our own alliances. So again, there's a very narrow way of understanding objectives, the one that you framed, and maybe you can say, narrowly understood, can we prolong our containment of Iran or Venezuela in this way? Not if we're standing by our own claims to care about human rights or humanitarian welfare or even stability in a region.
Yeah. We have questions from the audience. George Lopez raises Myanmar, William Chandler raises Russia. So how would you address the situation in those countries? And would you make a distinction between broad-based economic sanctions and targeted sanctions against human rights abusers? And also, we don't have to necessarily think in terms of sanctions. I mean, if this is something that doesn't work, we should think about other things. But what would that be? And what would be the principles that you think should guide us in understanding what is the way that is both effective, strategic, but also morally defensible in terms of not making the situation worse at a minimum?
Yeah, and I'll be brief to give, I don't want to go on too long, but I've already named, impact assessments to begin with, right? You're not going to impose any form of sanctions in Myanmar that's going to improve the situation if you're not actively and in advance seeking to understand the potential humanitarian cost associated with your actions. You can't say, I reject a human rights abusing situation and then adopt a strategy that enhances human rights abuses, obviously, right? So if that's your motivation and that's the moral dilemma that you're grappling with, then you have to attach yourself at a minimum to those civilian impact assessments, which we don't do credibly at this time at all, and an ongoing assessment of the effects. And basically, you would tailor it enormously more narrowly than anything we've been discussing today. Weapons embargoes, for example, make tons of sense for all the reasons that Peter has already alluded to and more. You can desist from selling weapons to actors that you believe are not only directly responsible in Myanmar, but also supporting the geopolitical context in Southeast Asia that's enabling that military junta to act in the way that it is. You can target individuals within the regime with financial consequences. But here too, there's an enormous overuse of this instrument and a listing mechanism for entities and individuals that far exceeds any narrowly tailored goal of pursuing a specific human rights abuser. And so one has to be careful in endorsing tools that then proliferate in ways that are out of control and that frequently don't have any meaningful oversight. But you would want to choose the narrowest possible approach if you're thinking of using these coercive instruments. And then we have to dramatically expand our toolkit. And again, Quincy has done a great job of talking about, reinvigorating what the American foreign policy toolkit looks like so that we have a broader array of tools available that aren't on the coercive register.
Peter, Josh, you guys want to jump in on this as well?
Yeah, I would just add, I think, questions like Myanmar are really, really difficult, obviously. It's you've got a hideous regime. And I do think that, maybe again, if one builds in the same kind of safeguards, there are certain very, very targeted sanctions against particular individual military leaders that, are they going to bring democracy to Myanmar? Unlikely, but maybe they have some small deterrent. Maybe they just, in some ways, maybe they provide some psychological benefit to the people who are struggling under that horrific regime. But I think that part of the problem is that, we don't first think about the more basic principle, which is, kind of Hippocratic, which is first do no harm, right? I mean, we often have these conversations is about the real, as if there are not so many regimes around the world where the United States does have more influence, because where we have troops, we're selling arms, we're providing money, we're training the militaries, all of these places, right? And those whether it's Ethiopia or Uganda, I mean, across the globe, right? Those conversations, those tend to get less attention, even though the United States has more influence. I came across this funny little debate just on YouTube a few years ago, that a young Noam Chomsky had with a much younger David Frum in Toronto, just out of and basically, Chomsky turned to him and said, listen, it was during the Cold War. He said, listen, Andrei Sakharov, the Soviet dissident, is not focused on human rights abuses in the United States. He's focused on human rights abuses in the Soviet Union and what it's doing, because that's where he has moral responsibility. And so that should be our first principle too. Again, not that we shouldn't care about Myanmar, of course we could, or what Assad is doing, or any of these, we should, but the low-hanging fruit is the stuff that we're doing ourselves, right? And yet so often that actually ends up really out of the spotlight in these moralistic conversations.
And I like to reiterate that. And in a sense, we've inflated, the United States has inflated its own sense of what it can do and its responsibility around the world to such an extent that we've made a terrible mess of things by overturning regimes in Iraq, trying to in Syria, Yemen, Libya, and you can just go right across all the regime change efforts, and we've made things so much worse by this overweening sense of our moral responsibility and what we can actually do. And I think it's so important for us to first take it down just a number of levels, to realize that we really don't have the tools and the ability to make people democratic and to make countries democratic that aren't democratic. People have to stumble towards that. There are certain things we can do, I suppose, but they're very limited. And that's what we're finding in places like Syria or Iraq. And that gets us back to the Hippocratic Oath, which is we have to be much more humble about what we can actually do and much more realistic about what our tools really are. Because quite cynically, people who have other ambitions have played to this humanistic instinct by giving us all this Yahoo stuff about human rights, and we're going to be enacting human rights through sanctions, which is completely false, and we just fall for it every damn time. And it hasn't helped us, and it hasn't helped other people.
Maybe I could just come in with one last thought, which is if there's going to be a transition in any of these places, Syria, Myanmar, et cetera, it's probably going to have to be one that's negotiated, in which the regime actors are induced in one way or another to step down. And none of that's going to be accomplished through the means that we're discussing here. So that really points, again, if we want to improve these situations, we have to improve the diplomatic engagement tools that we have available to us to work with our allies in those regions that are connected to these regimes and alter their own incentives in a variety of ways that have to do with inducement.
Thank you so much, Ashley. I think that those are excellent parting words. And I think what it also points to is what Peter mentioned earlier on. We really do have to understand these sanctions as part of the forever wars. I think, Josh, you mentioned that it would be good to make sure that sanctions bills had 2-year sunsets. Well, they actually used to. Many of these sanctions bills up until 2001, 2002, used to have sunsets. They used to be 2 years or 5 years, and Congress had to actively reenact them. And it didn't necessarily mean that it had the type of a humanitarian impact assessment that Ashley is calling for, but it nevertheless meant that there was another conversation every 5 or so years about whether this still made sense or not. Those are now completely gone, and the sanctions are forever, because we do not lift sanctions through Congress. We have very few examples of that ever happening. So once they're enacted in Congress with no sunsets, they're essentially there to stay unless we can fundamentally change the politics of this. And I think this conversation did us a great service in really distilling some of the key elements and variables of what that conversation needs to be, whether it is to reassess how the Soviet Union came down, whether it is to really lift up the principle that should be guiding us if we truly claim that we care about human rights. But also, I think, to understand that sanctions, particularly broad-based sanctions, tend to be a slippery slope towards a military confrontation. So if we want to pursue this path precisely because we don't want war, then we shouldn't be pursuing this path at all, because it tends to lead to war, according to the data has been collected. I want to thank you all so much. I want to apologize to the audience. There were great questions. I tried to get into as many of them as I could. Excellent conversation. Thank you so much to Josh, to Asli, to Peter for participating. Before I let everyone go, as always, I do want to plug our next event, which will be this Friday on April 30th, where we host a conversation on how Biden reached the decision to withdraw troops from Afghanistan and whether he will be able to keep his word. Ambassador Richard Olson, Vanda Feldbaugh-Brown, and Dr. Jonathan Schroden will speak on that panel. So if you haven't already, please sign up to the QI mailing list at www.quincyins.org, and you will receive notifications for all our future panels as well as our writings. And you also will have a chance of following Peter and Josh and Asli's work on our website as well. So thank you so much for today. It was a great pleasure having you, and look forward to seeing you